Welcome back, everyone, to Book Central Inside the Pages, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of books, writing, and everything in between. I'm your host, Abbie, and today, we have an incredible episode for you. We're going to talk about something that all writers need to master: research. Whether you're a fiction writer or you're working on non-fiction, research is the cornerstone that can elevate your work and make it truly shine. And with me today is the perfect guest to tackle this topic. She's a best-selling author, known for her meticulous research and deeply immersive storytelling, Tara Chilvers. Tara, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Abbie. I'm really excited to chat about this. It's a subject close to my heart, and one that often doesn't get enough attention.
Absolutely. Research is one of those things that some writers find incredibly daunting, and others find themselves getting lost in. It can be tricky to strike the right balance. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's start at the beginning. When you sit down to start a new project, where do you even begin your research? What's that first step for you?
That's a great place to start. For me, the first step is always about establishing a foundation. I look at what I already know, even if it's just a basic understanding of the topic. Then, I think about what I need to know in order to make the story authentic or accurate. So, for example, if I'm writing a historical fiction piece, I might already know the general time period, but I'll need to delve into specifics like the politics, the culture, the fashion, and even the slang people used. I make a list of these knowledge gaps, which helps focus my research. From there, I tend to start broad and then slowly narrow down. I'll begin with general overviews: history books, documentaries, that sort of thing, and then I dive deeper into the details as I go. The important thing is not to get overwhelmed at the beginning. You don't need to know everything up front.
I love that approach, starting with a foundation and then building on it as needed. So once you have your list of what you need to research, where do you go next? What are your go-to sources for reliable information?
That's where things get really interesting, because research is not a one-size-fits-all process. I like to use a combination of sources to get a well-rounded perspective. For books, I tend to rely on academic or peer-reviewed works, especially if I'm dealing with a subject that requires precision. Historical accounts, autobiographies, and expert-written texts are invaluable. I also make heavy use of documentaries and reputable news archives. These can offer a visual context or highlight elements that you wouldn't necessarily pick up from written sources. Then, of course, there's the internet, but I approach it with caution. You have to be discerning, because not everything you find online is accurate. Websites like Google Scholar are fantastic because they pull from peer-reviewed journals and academic papers. That's a goldmine if you're looking for credibility. I'll also check out JSTOR for more scholarly content. Another thing I highly recommend is speaking to experts directly. Interviews with people who have first-hand knowledge of a subject can bring a level of insight and nuance that books and articles just can't match. Whether it's a historian, a scientist, or someone who has lived through the events you're writing about, those interviews can be game changers.
You touched on something really important there: cross-referencing your sources. It's so easy to take the first thing you read or watch at face value, but that's not always wise. How do you cross-reference your information to make sure what you're using is reliable?
Cross-referencing is essential. It's about layering your information to make sure it holds up under scrutiny. Let's say I'm researching a battle that took place in the 1800s. I'll read accounts from multiple historians, but then I'll also watch documentaries and, if possible, visit the site itself. I try to look at the event from different perspectives. How do various sources describe the lead up to the battle, the tactics, the aftermath? If there are discrepancies between the accounts, that's a signal to dig deeper. I also look at the motivations behind the sources. If someone is writing from a particular political or social viewpoint, that could influence how they present the facts. So, it's important to remain objective and look for consensus among the sources. And if something feels off or inconsistent, I'll do a deeper dive. Sometimes, those inconsistencies can actually open up fascinating avenues for the story, or they can help clarify misunderstandings.
It's almost like being a detective. You're constantly sifting through evidence to find the truth. Does your approach change depending on whether you're writing fiction or non-fiction?
Yes, it definitely does. For non-fiction, the research is incredibly detailed and, most importantly, it has to be accurate from the outset. You're dealing with facts, so you can't afford to get them wrong. Before I even start writing, I make sure I have all my facts straight. The research for non-fiction is very front-loaded. It's about gathering as much information as possible before you put pen to paper, because the facts guide the narrative. With fiction, though, it's a little different. You have more creative freedom, but you still need your research to be solid. The difference is that I tend to research as I go. I'll write a scene and then realize, oh, I need to figure out what kind of weapon they would have used in this situation, or would this character realistically know how to do this? That way, the research becomes more of an ongoing process, and it's integrated into the flow of the story.
That's a really interesting approach, keeping the research ongoing instead of feeling like you have to have it all nailed down before you start. For fiction writers who might be overwhelmed by research, what's your advice for balancing research with the actual writing process?
First and foremost, don't let the research overwhelm you. A lot of writers fall into the trap of thinking they need to know everything before they start writing, and that can lead to paralysis. You don't have to become an expert in your subject before you begin. Start by writing what you know, even if it's just a scene or two. As you write, you'll naturally come across areas where you need more information. That's when you pause to do a bit of research and then get back to writing. One of the biggest mistakes I see writers make is using research as a form of procrastination. They tell themselves they can't start writing until they've read every book or watched every documentary on the subject. But the truth is, you don't need to know everything right away. You can fill in the gaps as you go. Research should serve the story, not the other way around.
That's such an important point. I think a lot of people will relate to the idea of using research as a form of procrastination. But how do you know when it's time to stop researching? When do you feel like you have enough information to move forward?
Knowing when to stop can be tough, especially when you're deep into it and there's always more you could learn. But you have to listen to your instincts. If you find yourself getting lost in the research and it's starting to feel like an excuse not to write, that's a good sign that it's time to step back and start putting words on the page. At the end of the day, you can always fact-check later during the editing process. I think of research as a tool, an important one, but just a tool. The real magic happens when you start crafting your story. So, if you feel like the research is bogging you down or you're hesitant to move forward because you don't know every little detail, that's when you have to say, okay, I've got enough to start.
That's such a helpful mindset, allowing yourself to move forward even when you don't have all the answers. I think that'll be a huge relief to a lot of writers out there. Let's talk about some practical tools and resources. Are there any specific tools you rely on to organize your research or make the process easier?
Oh, yes. I'm a big fan of staying organized. It's so easy for research to get scattered, especially if you're working on a long project. I personally use Scrivener, which is a fantastic writing tool that allows you to store all your research right alongside your manuscript. It's brilliant for keeping everything in one place: your notes, your research, your outline, and you can access it all with just a click. For online research, I use Evernote to clip articles and save them into specific notebooks for each project. And, of course, there's always the trusty notebook and highlighter method if you prefer something more tactile. The important thing is to have a system that works for you, whether it's digital or paper-based.
Scrivener really is a game changer, isn't it? Having everything in one place just makes the whole process so much smoother. You mentioned earlier that you sometimes reach out to experts for interviews. That sounds a bit intimidating for newer writers. What advice would you give to someone who wants to reach out but isn't sure how to approach it?
It can definitely feel intimidating at first, but the key is to remember that most experts are passionate about their field and are often more than happy to talk about it. The worst that can happen is they say no, but more often than not, people are willing to help, especially if you approach them with genuine interest. When reaching out, be respectful of their time. Keep your initial message short and to the point. Introduce yourself, explain what you're working on, and ask if they'd be willing to answer a few questions or point you in the right direction. I've found that LinkedIn can be a great platform for this because it's a professional space where people expect to make connections.
That's such great advice. And I imagine even if you don't get a response right away, it's worth following up politely, right?
Exactly. Don't be discouraged if you don't hear back immediately. A gentle, polite follow-up can sometimes be all it takes to get a response. But always be respectful of their time and don't be pushy. It's all about building relationships and being genuinely curious about their field of expertise.
Such useful advice. Now, before we wrap up, do you have any final tips or thoughts for writers out there who are tackling their research?
My biggest tip is to enjoy the process. Research can be incredibly rewarding. It opens up new worlds and ideas that can inspire and enrich your writing. But don't let it become an excuse not to write. It's about finding that balance, doing enough research to make your story believable, but not so much that you never get around to telling it. Trust yourself, trust your instincts, and remember that you can always refine the details later.
That's such a great note to end on, Tara. Thank you so much for joining us today. This conversation has been full of insights, and I know our listeners will be taking away a lot from it.
Thank you, Abbie. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Books Central Inside the Pages. Don't forget to check out Tara's latest book. It's a must-read. And if you're working on your own writing project, remember to balance your research with your creativity. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll be back next week with more tips, interviews, and inspiration. Until then, happy writing.